Welcome to the License to Lead podcast. I'm Patty Fay. This podcast is for physicians or anyone who thinks healthcare needs a transformation led by physicians. License to Lead means that physicians are charged with and must be in charge of guiding the vision, the standards, and the culture of healthcare systems. If you want to join in the conversation or learn more about activating physician leadership, go to license2leadpodcast.com, where you can send me an email or even leave me a voice message. I'd love to hear from you. Hi, everyone. Welcome to License to Lead podcast number 3. This is Patty Fay. The License to Lead podcast is focused on why physicians must lead if we want to get out of the fix our healthcare industry is in. In the last episode, I talked about physician characteristics that explain why we, as physicians, are uniquely suited to leadership roles. I debunked a few myths about physicians and then laid out the evidence that shows physician-led systems have better outcomes. In this episode, I'm going to talk about our current state, who is running healthcare. This will be a close look at graduate business degrees, particularly the Master's in Business Administration, or MBA, and I'll also talk about the Master's in Healthcare Administration, or MHA degree. Digging deeper into this topic has been illuminating. When I'm teaching recruiting and selection, I'll often talk about how, in a previous executive role when I was hiring dozens of physicians every year, I would have at best a neutral response to finding out that a physician candidate had an MBA. You might guess the reason for that was because I was hiring physicians to see patients and didn't want any hint that they were angling for a management job. But you'd be wrong. My theme when recruiting and selecting physicians was a full-on, resounding physician as a leader theme. Many of my interview questions were geared to leadership behaviors, and I'd revamped physician orientation to be the first step in leadership development for new hire physicians. So I was all about, and still am all about, hiring and encouraging physician as leader, whether in formal or informal roles. Physician as leader was and is the headline for the work I do. But I was never impressed with an MBA in the way a candidate seemed to think I ought to be, considering how I was clearly mining for leadership skills. My worry was that an MBA was some kind of compensatory mechanism, at least if it's voluntary. Sometimes docs are prompted to get an MBA for some role. So anyway, I tried to figure out if these MBA'd docs had been inspiring for management, but not embraced by their peers. Was the MBA a way to try to force the issue to credential themselves into leadership positions when they didn't actually have the trust of their colleagues? The very best physician leaders I know don't have a graduate business degree. I mean, really, when would they have time? They're tapped to participate or lead every important committee and invited to endless meetings. And the best physician leaders I know are basically learning machines. So what would an MBA offer that they couldn't learn much more quickly by asking people and trying a few things, or taking a focused course over a few days or a few weeks? I mentioned in the first podcast how I had hightailed it out to Stanford for a 1-week executive HR course just as I was starting in my role as the AMD of HR at Kaiser Permanente. I was in a position to create my own strategic role. I was already a fan of Jeffrey Pfeffer's work out at Stanford, and he and his outstanding colleagues were exactly what I needed, just in time. So I had my compensatory mechanism theory about why I raised an eyebrow at the MBAs until I started researching this issue a bit more. What I've discovered is that there are factors related to the graduate business school ideology, the mindset created in an MBA program, that helps explain the spidey sense I get with docs who have an MBA in their resume. I'm talking about these graduate business degrees, Master's in Business Administration and Master's in Healthcare Administration, aka MBAs and MHAs, in this podcast because those are the most common credentials of the CEOs of hospitals and health systems. As I mentioned in the first License to Lead podcast, the profession of medicine is unusual in not a good way, in that the hospitals and systems we work in are usually not run by physicians. 90 to 95% of hospitals and health systems are led by a CEO who is not a doctor. Now, to give you a hint of what's to come, because I don't want to catch you off guard, here's a headline for you before I launch into details. In 2018, Martin Parker, wrote an article for The Guardian titled, quote, "Why We Should Bulldoze the Business School," close quote. And it had the subtitle, quote, "There are 13,000 business schools on earth. That's 13,000 too many, and I should know I've taught in them for 20 years, close quote. Professor Parker also published a book in 2018 titled Shut Down the Business School, an insider's account of what's wrong with management education. Okay, listeners, buckle up because this is how this podcast is going to go. In my podcast planning checklist, I have an entry that says, look for opposing views, find support for current MBA approach/outcomes. I'm afraid that's a box that I can't check. I invite my listeners to try to find that positive information and data about graduate business school results. Now, if you do try to help me out and you Google this, beware. Those 13,000 institutions Professor Parker talked about have all mastered search engine optimization to get their blurbs out there, extolling the virtues of their MBA program. But I had no luck finding legitimate studies or evidence confirming positive outcomes. So the structure for this podcast is as follows. Part 1, some nuts and bolts about the MBA. Part 2, the controversies. What on earth is this bulldozer recommendation all about? Part 3, outcome studies. What will a student or an employer get as a result of having or hiring that MBA? Then I'll provide some information on the MHA and wrap this podcast up with my conclusions. Part 1, what are the nuts and bolts of an MBA? The Master's in Business Administration, or MBA, is the classic business graduate degree. The traditional version is a classroom-based 2-year degree focused on courses like accounting, finance, statistics, and marketing, etc. Grads are prepared to seek jobs as analysts, strategists, managers, and consultants in any industry. Business school ideology promotes the idea that this body of knowledge is applicable in any organization. That said, many grads migrate toward finance, investment banking, and entrepreneurial roles. The MBA features tools and research that deliberately bring the aura of science to the business training. And I say deliberately because in the 1950s, business schools were upgraded. They shifted from being a trade school, where the faculty might include the general manager from the sugar beet factory down the street, and they shifted over to a university setting. This was a massive overhaul, and a big infusion of funding helped create academic programs that were suitable for a university setting, that were respectable and research-oriented, and more like math or science. It's been said that the business schools of old suffered from physics envy. The transformation was huge from trade school to cash cow. Nowadays, 25% of all master's degrees that are awarded are MBAs. And many business schools are housed in fancy buildings emblazoned with the names of rich donors advertising just how rich they are. Traditionally, in schools of law and medicine, the schools and buildings are named for renowned professors and contributors to the field of study, though this cash for naming rights is metastasizing across campuses. What does an MBA claim to offer a student or an employer? Warren Bennis, a major mucky-muck among leadership scholars, said most business schools claimed a dual mission: to educate practitioners and to create knowledge through research. When they shifted from the trade school to the university setting, it represented a shift from focus on the first, educating practitioners, to what most scholars now see as an unbalanced focus on the second, research. As far as the first goal, educating practitioners, there are two kind of obvious sub-goals. The first is to give grad students capabilities so they can have a successful career as a manager. And the second is to bring value to the businesses who employ them. Traditional MBA programs in the U.S. require an undergraduate degree and submission of a GME or GMAT to apply, at least in the legitimately accredited programs. There are over 500 business schools in the U.S. that have been accredited by the AACSB, the Association to Advance Collegiate Schools of Business. And that's what I will refer to in this podcast as the highly regarded accrediting body. According to John Byrne, a former editor-in-chief at Business Week and Fast Company, there are 200,000 MBA degrees granted every year. Compare this to medicine. 35,000 physician degrees are granted every year, and these are U.S. statistics. In addition to the traditional MBAs, MBAs are also packaged for part-time students and for executives. And there are at least 300 programs providing an online MBA. Not all, but most of these online programs are not accredited, don't require GMAT or GRE scores, and are suspect. The cost of an MBA can range from an upper echelon on-campus MBA at Harvard, where the tuition alone costs $140,000, to the other end of the spectrum, where you can get an online MBA for less than $20,000. Let me give you an example of a scary online offering. The school with the single largest enrollment of online MBA students, 4,000 students at once, is Liberty University, founded by Jerry Falwell Sr. According to Byrne, they have no regular live classes online, no required in-person or on-campus teaching. Of course, it's not accredited by the AACSB. A quarter of the students drop out in the first year, and less than half graduate. But of course, that means half do graduate and have an MBA diploma to show for it. A bunch of the online programs for both MBAs and MHAs have all the characteristics of predatory educational programs, with fake accreditation, zero barriers to entry, and false advertising. So that's the thumbnail introduction to MBAs. And as you heard, there's a lot of variability in the academic rigor of the education, the prestige, the price, and the venue of the education. And hey, you might be asking, how about variability in outcomes? Well, I'll talk about outcomes in part 3 after this next section on controversies. Stay tuned. Part 2, MBA-related controversies. There are 3 controversies I'll delve into that are relevant to healthcare. The first questions the very premise: can you teach someone to be a manager outside the context of the business? The second controversy is the academic research orientation, the science not people approach. And the third controversy is that there is a singular business school ideology related to self-interest and profit that is universally accepted. Before I launch into this juicy stuff, let me reflect. Early in my management career as a shiny new chief of a local internal medicine clinic, I noticed that I was not of like mind with many people in management who had business, not clinical backgrounds. No biggie. Of course, I assumed I had a lot to learn, and that was reinforced with the many assumptions and stereotypes about physicians' limited leadership skill set, the subject of my last podcast. The sense of a deeper divide took shape over the years, but primarily in the direction of me coming to believe that doctors ought to be running things because our systems and staff needed the advantages of leadership grounded in the core business of medicine. So my interpretation was that we needed more of what docs, at their best, could bring to leadership. And what wasn't obvious to me until researching this topic was that there was another force at work, something systemically flawed about a business school mindset. It's not simply that the profession of medicine, like the professions of law and architecture and engineering, will be even better served if managed by doctors, lawyers, architects, and engineers. But by turning our organizations over to people steeped in business school ideology, we've created and endured approaches to management that harm organizational culture, not just in healthcare, but in many industries. The first controversy is whether the very premise of graduate business school is flawed. Can you train students outside the context of the business they're going to end up in to be a manager? Or is learning to manage experiential? Henry Mintzberg, a professor at McGill, author of America's Monumental Failure of Management, was interviewed in a Harvard Business Review article titled Rethinking the MBA. He said business schools claim that their grad students are being trained to manage in all sorts of organizations, businesses, government, the social sector, and so on. And Mintzberg says that's just dead wrong. And here's a great quote, which harks back to what I defined as tacit knowledge in the last podcast. Mintzberg said, in order to manage, quote, you have to understand the context and you have to understand the industry. You have to understand the organization. You have to understand its culture. You've got to get in deep close quote. He particularly emphasized the danger of placing newly minted MBAs in consulting positions like McKinsey and parachuting them into senior management roles. Mintzberg said, quote, "They're detached from what they're managing. It's a disconnected form of managing that's very dysfunctional and very destructive of the organization," close quote. Mintzberg made the point in a 2008 interview that bad management was the cause of the Great Recession. It was not a banking or finance issue. He pointed to two big indicators of management gone wrong. Management short-termism, quote, "Write those mortgages as quick as you can, cash in and get the heck out," which is a very short-term perspective with people who are mismanaging. This is partly because they do not care about the long term, and partly because they do not care about their own institutions or customers. They care about themselves, close quote. He called the management decisions to buy the subprime mortgages absurd. Managers were not sufficiently awake or even remotely concerned to realize how bad this junk was. Quote, "So everything was short term and everybody is under pressure and everybody is meeting their targets for each short term period, and so they were not managing," close quote. Mintzberg is the author of 150 articles and 15 books, including one titled Managers Not MBAs. He says management is not a profession, and he says it is not a science. You can't learn it the way you learn surgery or engineering. He should know. He was a mechanical engineer before pursuing his master's and PhD in management at MIT. He goes on to say, management is a practice, and you learn management by practicing management. You don't become a manager in a classroom. Mintzberg particularly emphasizes that, quote, "You can't train young people to be managers," close quote. He talks about the danger of taking people who are too young to have had much experience managing, and then, quote, "You educate them in the belief that they're becoming managers and leaders. All too often you create hubris from that," close quote. In License to Lead episode number 1, I talked about the newly MBA'd, blue-suited, confident consultants who swarmed the healthcare organization where I worked, and the self-assured presentations with PowerPoints filled with statistics and models that explained why we physicians would be getting on board with this or that. I wasn't able to articulate why I felt such recoil back then, so thank you, Henry Mintzberg, for giving words to what I experienced and the effect on the culture: detached, disconnected, and dysfunctional. Mintzberg is adamant that the graduate business school education, the conventional MBA, can't be fixed. Mintzberg has created an approach himself for developing management skills that uses a combination of coaching and small group work for people who are already in management positions. They share and learn from their own real issues. The HBR interviewer asked Professor Mintzberg if he was saying they ought to scupper the conventional MBA. Scupper means to sink a ship or its crew deliberately. Mintzberg's response was, quote, "Close them all down, period," close quote. The second controversy in graduate business schools is their singular focus on so-called scientific research. This refers to a focus on tools, models, measurement, and research, as opposed to a focus on the messy stuff of people. The grad school assesses its success based on its research, esoteric, impractical research, according to, well, everybody. But the point is, they don't measure their outcomes based on the managerial competence of their graduates. This failing of business schools was articulated by the late Warren Bennis, who was one of the most highly acclaimed scholars in the study of leadership. He and his co-author, James O'Toole, wrote a 2005 Harvard Business Review article titled, "How Business Schools Lost Their Way." They pointed to comprehensive failings of business schools to be effective or ethical, and they faulted what they chose to call the scientific model. This happened as a result of the reinvention that moved business schools from being poorly regarded trade schools to becoming the gleaming academic centerpieces and cash cows that they are today. Bennis and O'Toole said that the scientific approach is not the right model to be applied to business, that business is a human activity where judgments have to be made with messy, incomplete, and incoherent data. And when this scientific approach is used in such cases, then, quote, "statistical and methodological wizardry can blind rather than illuminate," close quote. They bemoaned the fact that it's possible to find tenured professors of management who have never set foot inside a real business except as customers. They said that the research methods that underpin the whole curriculum and the whole philosophy of the business schools, quote, call for little insight into complex social and human factors and minimal time in the field discovering the actual problems facing managers, close quote. They point fingers at what they call the professoriate, who can claim academic respectability but don't have to prove any actual business skills. Bennis and O'Toole said that too many business school professors limit their sights to what they can readily measure, instead of searching for new ways to study what is important. Quote, in business research, the things routinely ignored on the grounds that they cannot be measured, such as most human factors and all matters relating to judgment, ethics, and morality, are exactly what make the difference between good business decisions and bad ones, close quote. The third controversy is the ideology embraced, apparently without challenge by business schools. Martin Parker, who wrote the Why We Should Bulldoze the Business Schools article, really hammers home the point that business schools have adopted a singular point of view, managerialism. Parker states that, quote, business schools have huge influence, yet they are also widely regarded to be intellectually fraudulent places, fostering a culture of short-termism and greed, close quote. His take, and thus his bulldozing recommendation, is that fiddling with the curriculum won't work because there's a systemic problem in that business schools embrace just one ideology, that of market managerialism. What the heck is managerialism, you ask? Well, my take is that it's the belief that there's a body of knowledge called management that can and should be applied to any and every organization. According to this ideology, the managed organization is the fundamental unit of society. Managers are the high priests and priestesses with special information and special tools. The point of view or the protagonist in the managerialism story is the manager, and everyone else is there to be managed or manipulated into doing what the manager wants done so that the manager is served and the organization makes a profit. Now, that's my interpretation. There is an emphasis on sterile efficiency, profit, and greed, which are constants in the critiques of business schools. And these critiques are coming from within by highly credentialed, highly regarded professors in the graduate business schools. Most of us credit the fictional character Gordon Gekko with creating the tagline, "Greed is good." But after researching graduate business education, it's clear that many detractors see that phrase as a tenet of business school ideology. Greed is good is to the MBA as do no harm is to medicine. Another element of managerialism is the belief in a superior set of instruments that can be used to understand and manage any organization. So that bright young face with no experience in an organization or on a team can get an MBA and then choose from a menu of businesses, high tech, the sugar beet plant, an outlet mall, St. Elsewhere Health Systems, or the Homeland Security offices. Fresh MBAs have been prepped to believe they could manage any of them because what matters are the tools, the spreadsheets, financial statements, and statistical techniques, not the business or the people or the mission or the community. H. Thomas Johnson, an economist and accounting expert, made the observation that, quote, managers believed they could make decisions without knowing the company's products, technologies, or customers. They had only to understand the intricacies of financial reporting, close quote. I imagine this would make Professor Mintzberg apoplectic. Remember, he's the one who said to be a manager, you've got to understand the context, the organization, and the culture. You've got to get in deep. Another assumption that underpins business school curriculum, according to Parker, is that of rational egoism, another way of saying flagrant self-interest. If you want a more accurate definition of rational egoism, go ahead and look it up in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Yeah, go ahead and do that and take your cell phone and a sandwich because you may never get out of there. Other elements of managerialism are beliefs in hierarchy, control, and measurement. Thomas Kleikhauer is a professor who wrote a book titled Managerialism, A Critique of an Ideology. Kleikhauer seems to think this ideology is ubiquitous, that it has, without fanfare, taken over most of our institutions. And he thinks that this managerialism, which is the framework for traditional business school curriculum, may sink society. Why? Because global warming or depleted environmental resources or poverty or misery is not a concern of this ideology. What is the concern? Making money, restricting resources. You've probably heard this one as, we have to do more with less. And creating a command and control hierarchy. As the U.S. income gap has widened and many Americans need 2 or more jobs to make ends meet, CEOs have supersized their incomes. According to Robert Shapiro, founder of an economics consulting firm, U.S. companies have $2.1 trillion stashed overseas. In the words of my favorite comedian, Sebastian Maniscalco, aren't you embarrassed? Well, that's probably as good as any segue to the third part of today's podcast. What's the evidence that a graduate business degree is valuable for the individual or for the company? Here we go. Part 3. In Part 3, I'll look at results associated with getting an MBA and with hiring someone with an MBA. Do MBAs help an individual's career? And do MBAs help businesses perform better? The answer to both of these questions depends on if you believe the evidence versus what everyone seems to invest in. MBA students with their precious time and money, and employers by hiring enormous numbers of MBAs. Universities don't seem to invest in business schools exactly. Business schools are more like the college football team, at least the upper echelon business schools. It's a real revenue and prestige generator. Never you mind the concussions and crummy education. Universities take exquisite care of these cash cows. Rich alums pay the business schools to put their names on the buildings, and donating money seems to be an endorsement of what's going on inside. So that's a lot of momentum driving business schools as usual. Are you going to pay attention to internal critics and evidence of poor outcomes, or pay attention to the big bucks rolling in? And just to jump to the punchline of my original question, do MBAs help an individual's career and do they help businesses perform better? No. MBAs do not contribute to better outcomes for grads or for businesses who hire the grads. But let's go ahead and take a look at the evidence. 15 years ago, back in 2005, Warren Bennis and James O'Toole said that the MBA programs were faced with intense criticism from all quarters, including deans of some of America's most prestigious business schools. What were the criticisms? Failing to impart useful skills, failing to prepare leaders, failing to instill norms of ethical behavior, and even failing to lead graduates to good corporate jobs. Danny Miller, the director of a research center at a business school in Montreal, states that business schools emphasize short-termism, the bottom line, managing by the numbers, narrow, finite decision-making, and theories that celebrate financial achievement. In a 2019 study titled MBA CEOs, Short-Term Management and Performance, Danny Miller and Xiaowei Xu studied 5,000 CEOs. 35% of those 5,000 CEOs had MBAs. Miller found that the CEOs who had MBAs managed in a different way from the non-MBA leaders. They tended to use earnings management, which is the accounting phrase for artificially boosting earnings by manipulating the accounting records. And the CEOs with MBAs also spent less on research and development. Both of these tactics resulted in an immediate and artificial increase in profits and then a subsequent decline. Miller said that the firms run by CEOs with MBAs had inferior performance, and despite their inferior performance, they managed to boost their compensation significantly more than non-MBA colleagues. Now, the researchers, of course, do not ascribe cause and effect. Quote, "It may be those with short-termist, opportunistic tendencies choose to enter business schools rather than programs in the arts and sciences. Nonetheless, the connection between MBA programs and our results is a sobering one." Close quote. I'm not so sure that the alternative explanation that Danny Miller provided is in any way reassuring, that people who are already opportunistic are the ones who tend to go after an MBA. Well, I suppose it would allow the business schools to say, we didn't teach them their rational egoism, we just enrolled rational egoists. I rolled that term out there again to see if you were listening earlier. Staying clear of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, I went to Wikipedia instead, and it says rational egoism, also called rational selfishness, is the principle that an action is rational if and only if it maximizes one's self-interest. In 2010, Matthew Stewart wrote an article titled Rest in Peace MBA, actually titled RIP MBA, in which he says the contribution of the MBA to individual career performance doesn't exist. And then he uses a doctor analogy, quote, if the relevance of an MD to the performance of doctors were even half as unsubstantiated, we'd probably be fantasizing about tossing a few physicians in jail too, close quote. As an aside, it's remarkable how many comparisons to doctors and the profession of medicine and medical training that I came across. And in every case, the example or metaphor casts physicians in a favorable light. Back to Stewart's article, RIP MBA, he's particularly focused on the business school role in recent banking and financial crises. As he says, quote, isn't it just a little suspicious after all that the sector that showed the greatest appetite for MBAs was the most grotesquely mismanaged? Close quote. Then he echoes Henry Mintzberg's point of view with this statement. In fact, the economic crisis has exposed long-standing flaws, not just in the modern approach to business education, but in the very idea of business education. Another article took a look at the issues of values in business education. Venkat Krishnan, who has a master's in philosophy and a PhD in business, conducted a study titled Impact of an MBA Education on Students' Values. His results were published in the Journal of Business Ethics. He studied 5 graduating classes of MBAs and assessed change in grad students' values over time. The author noted that human values are an ignored domain of investigation in business school education. And he said, values form the core of our personality and influence the choices we make, the people we trust, the appeals that we respond to, and the way we invest our time and energy. It is necessary that values are given their due importance within management education. I liked that sentiment. Krishnan summarized his results, quote, management education increases the importance of self-oriented values, such as a comfortable life and pleasure, and reduces the importance of others-oriented values, such as being helpful or polite. In 2019, Randall D. Fisher presented findings of his research in an article titled A Triangulation Assessment, the Value of an MBA Degree. His principal research question was, how successful are MBA programs in meeting the competency needs of employers who are hiring MBA graduates? He looked at 53 empirical studies, 14 published articles, and 10 employer-related surveys. And I quote, the findings revealed a lack of empirical data demonstrating that competency skills employees gained in an MBA program have an impact in the business world. My go-to Stanford Business School professor and prolific author Jeffrey Pfeffer and co-author Christina Fong wrote an in-depth review article back in 2002 titled The End of Business Schools, Less Success Than Meets the Eye. As I've come to expect from Pfeffer, he was ahead of the curve, and this article is comprehensive, practical, and well-written. Pfeffer et al. Point to persistent themes in the criticism of business schools. That includes an overemphasis on analysis at the expense of the development of wisdom, leadership, and interpersonal skills. Pfeffer and Fong quote Harold Levitt, a management psychologist, who said, quote, we have built a weird, almost unimaginable design for MBA-level education that distorts those subjected to it into critters with lopsided brains, icy hearts, and shrunken souls, close quote. Wow. So, what were Pfeffer and Fong's findings? Well, here are their conclusions. Quote, Neither possessing an MBA degree nor grades earned in courses correlate with career success. These results question the effectiveness of schools in preparing their students. And there is little evidence that business school research is influential on management practice, calling into question the professional relevance of management scholarship, close quote. The authors find that the barriers to changing the business schools are quite daunting. Faculty shortages, faculty that's short on the new skills that are needed, and the inertia of the institutions in the face of heavy criticism. Another business school professor, Martin Parker, has condemned business school curriculum and ideology in very colorful language, and he says the fact that he can get away with it speaks volumes. The insider's dissent has become thoroughly institutionalized. But back to Pfeffer and Fong and the barriers to rehabilitating business education, they also make the point that it's simply not in the interest of the most prestigious business schools to change. They are basically winning. I'll wrap up this part about outcomes with research that's way too interesting. This study is also from Danny Miller and Xiawei Xu. The study was titled Behavior Among Celebrated MBA CEOs. Miller, the lead author, said they were trying to figure out whether the accusations that MBAs are self-serving were accurate or not. They looked at 444 celebrity CEOs who had been celebrated on the covers of major business magazines, Fortune, Forbes, or Businessweek, and then looked at the performance of the celebrities' firms after their appearances on magazine covers. The theory was that the CEOs would have an opportunity to exploit their magazine cover fame and engage in self-serving behavior that would benefit them but hurt their companies. Of the 444 celebrity CEOs, 25% of them had an MBA. What were the results? By this point, you probably have an inkling. In the 3 years after they appeared on a magazine cover, the firms of the MBA CEOs saw a market value decline that was 20% greater than that of firms run by non-MBAs. And despite poorer performance, the MBAs saw their compensation go up about 15% faster than the non-MBAs in the 3 years after the cover story. And the MBAs were paid about $1 million more each year. All that despite poorer performance. While careful to point out that the study established association, not causation, Miller also said many MBA programs emphasize short-term bottom-line performance, financial and accounting measures and levers, stock prices, competition, and personal and economic success. They place less emphasis on creative and scientific skills, intrinsic job satisfaction, social contribution, and the ethical treatment of stakeholders. Miller, who has an MBA and is a research professor in a business school, would have preferred a different outcome. He said that he and his colleague Xu expected, at worst, no effect. Quote, "Many of our colleagues have MBAs and are capable, ethical people. So don't use our study to disparage MBAs, but be on the lookout for evidence of the kinds of opportunistic behavior we described, regardless of who the CEO is." Close quote. Henry Mintzberg commented on executive pay. He said the day of excessive executive pay ought to be over, especially after the high-profile ethical and financial crises of the early 2000s. He said that boards say they have to offer huge salaries and bonuses to keep top talent, but Mintzberg turns that on its head. He says that anyone that demands these bonuses are demonstrating that they're not team players, and that fact should disqualify them from consideration. So, with all these outstanding thinkers from inside business schools identifying devastating problems emanating from MBA education, with all of this going on, you'd think there'd be big change afoot. And many business schools do claim to be poking and prodding the existing curriculum. According to an article in the November 2nd, 2019 Economist, people are demanding to be taught business beyond the primacy of shareholder value. And to that end, Duke has added a course titled Capitalism and Common Purpose in a World of Differences. And Harvard Business School has added a class called Leadership and Corporate Accountability. The colorful business school professor Martin Parker of Bulldozer fame says, quote, The problem is that business ethics and corporate social responsibility are subjects used as window dressing in the marketing of the business school and as a fig leaf to cover the conscience of business school deans, as if talking about ethics and responsibility were the same as doing something about it, close quote. His view might be unwittingly corroborated in an article that's right on the website of the official accrediting body for business schools, the AACSB. A July 2018 article is titled Imagining a New MBA, and it's written by Andrew Crisp, a consultant for higher education clients. He said that his research suggests that tomorrow's MBA will be changed by new demands. What new demands, you might ask? Quote, among the most prominent factors shaping the industry are prospective students' demands for quicker returns, almost instant gratification, and flexible services tailored to their individual needs. According to our research, this trend has resulted in students increasingly preferring one-year MBA programs over two-year formats as they seek faster and cheaper paths to the degree, as well as a bigger return on their educational investment, close quote. Now, isn't that just a little tone deaf for the web page of the accrediting body of MBA programs that are almost universally accused of toxic short-termism? Yikes. Let's turn our attention for a few minutes to the MHA degree. So what's the story with the Masters in Healthcare Administration, the MHA? How does it compare to the Masters in Business Administration? There are an array of specialized graduate business degrees for people in healthcare, but I'll focus on the MHA. It is geared to people who want a graduate business degree and they intend to or already work in healthcare. It is intended to be seen as an MBA for people who work in the healthcare industry. It has a different accrediting body than a traditional MBA, and home base for the MHA can be either in a graduate business school or it can be associated with a school of medicine or school of public health, etc. Compared to the mother lode of articles and research out there about the traditional business school-based MBAs, there's a lot less information to be found about the MHA. There's a lot of overlap in curriculum, with the MBA heavily focused on finance and the MHA including courses like health informatics and health economics. Peter Hilsenrath, who wrote a history of graduate healthcare management education in 2012, said that originally the MHA was offered through business schools, and the changes in business school curriculum spilled over to the MHA. Hilsenrath said, quote, the power structure of professional control in academic medical centers is yielding to managerial agency, and this is shifting control from physicians to a new generation with more of a business mindset, close quote. Shifting control from physicians to a new generation with more of a business mindset. So we can just let that concept land for a few extra seconds. One similarity between the MHA and the MBA is the promise that the degree will grant managerial and leadership skill. The Georgetown University website states that, quote, if you are fascinated by the inner workings of a hospital, for instance, an MHA will provide you with the in-depth instruction necessary to help manage the entire operation, close quote. One website describing careers in healthcare states that an MHA will, quote, set you on the path towards being a leader. You will be at the helm of healthcare systems directing their operations, close quote. Like the MBA, there are online MHA offerings, and most of these are not officially accredited, but yet the promises are tantalizing. Quote, the online master's degree of healthcare administration prepares students as they become the next generation of executive healthcare leaders by combining real-world experience and competency-based coursework in an innovative learning environment, close quote. That innovative learning environment is the student's sofa or a coffee shop, I guess, because it goes on to say that it's 100% online. No campus visits are required. And even though the GRE or GMAT are considered the entrance exams for graduate business degrees, those are not required either. I didn't find a lot of data or legitimate studies looking at the Master's in Healthcare Administration degree. What I don't know and couldn't find Is there any reason to get an MHA? Is there any actual evidence of benefit to your career, your salary, or your ability to manage? Or is there any benefit to the organization? That's a lot of time that someone could spend meeting with organizational leaders and other experts, creating their own learning plan in the context of their existing workplace. And I suspect that all the business school professors that I've quoted in this podcast would actually endorse that learning plan. Another question I'd love answered is, what portion of students who don't get accepted into medical school shift over to the MHA track? I started thinking about this years ago when a physician told me about day one in his MHA program. The professor announced to the class that there were several physicians in the program. And the professor said, be nice to them. And just remember, none of them went to medical school because they couldn't get into business school. When I heard this story, I remember thinking, ooh, ouch, that's rude. And then I thought about it some more. First, it made me wonder, was there a reason other than just amusing banter that he asked them to be nice to the physicians in the class? How much discussion is there usually in these programs about physician as problem? Is there a theme that runs through MHA classes and right back into our organizations that bolsters some of the antipathy towards physicians? Do MHA programs reinforce the idea that physicians are the cross that these budding managers and executive leaders of tomorrow have to bear? Beats me. I don't know. But I'd love to hear from any listeners who do know. Please give me the scoop. The second thing the professor's remark made me ponder is, what is the percentage of students who enroll in an MHA program after not getting into medical school? I mean, is that a thing? And if it is, imagine that student with no work experience or context exposed to a theme of needing to manage those problematic physicians. It seems to me that they could pop out of their MHA program with the hubris that Professor Mintzberg talked about, and possibly a bit of a chip on their shoulders about these doctors, their rivals who did get into medical school. Now, all that might be a lot of BS, but I'd like to know. Corroborating this idea recently, okay, now admittedly, this is with an N of 1, a friend told me about a conversation with a new MHA grad who had no work experience yet and who was very quick to let it be known that getting doctors in line was going to be an important part of their new job. That's hubris. Before I wrap up, I'd like to mention the absolutely excellent physician leaders who I most admire, the rock stars I've coached, clients I've worked with, colleagues who are remarkably skilled leaders. None of them have an MBA or an MHA. One of my executive coaching clients has started working on an MBA because it's an expectation for the role, but honestly, it's a distraction from the leadership work. There is a long list of high-profile physician leaders who don't have an MBA or MHA. Dr. Noseworthy and his new successor, Dr. Ferruggio, at the Mayo Clinic don't. Physician leaders at Hopkins, UC Davis, Dartmouth, Mount Sinai, Brigham and Women's, the former Surgeon General, Dr. Shulkin, my former boss, Jack Cochran, who had a national role as president and CEO of the Permanente Federation, Don Berwick, the brilliant founder of the IHI, and Brent James, the founder of Intermountain Health. None of them have an MBA or MHA. Let's wrap up this podcast. What do I make of all this? What are the implications? I do have a new perspective on what it means when someone says an MBA is a terminal degree. Other thoughts. Number one, physicians must lead. In the last podcast, I discussed the evidence that supports why physicians are best positioned to lead the healthcare industry. And the content of this podcast adds a reinforcing dimension, the fact that the ideology and the outcomes of business school education, based on the evidence, can be harmful to an organization's culture and outcomes. Number two, physicians have to learn whatever concepts and tools are necessary for them to function as expert leaders in their organizations. And that education can be customized and the formal aspects of it relatively brief. One consulting group ran an inadvertent study on just how quickly non-MBAs can pick up a business education. According to David Lenart with the New York Times, the Boston Consulting Group hired a bunch of professionals like docs and lawyers to be business consultants. None had MBAs, and they gave them a 3-week crash course in the basics of business. 3 weeks. And then turned them loose as consultants. According to their internal studies, quote, the lawyers and doctors and philosophers and engineers performed no worse than their business school counterparts. And if anything, they were promoted faster on average, close quote. Number 3, physician leaders must have an opinion about the role of graduate business training in healthcare. Is there a role for any MBAs? We all know fantastic people who have MBAs. So I'd recommend my approach. Treat an MBA degree as an, at best, neutral feature of an administrative candidate's resume. We want the fantastic people. We don't want the business school ideology. And as far as leadership development, I'd recommend structured internal development using small groups, real issues, organizational leaders as faculty, and time for reflection and sharing solutions in the context of the business we're in. I'll talk about Henry Mintzberg's management training for organizations in a later podcast. I'll talk more about my own leadership development programs in multiple podcasts in 2020. Meanwhile, all my listeners, if possible, and certainly all physician leaders, should make a point to weigh in on the credentials of incoming personnel and weigh in on how to invest educational resources in a useful, not destructive or low-value direction. Number 4, finally, more study is needed to answer how much harm is done when a business school ideology runs healthcare. How much is the oversupply of MBAs and MHAs driving the extraordinary growth of administration in healthcare and the parallel escalation of healthcare costs? The MBA managerialism mindset conflicts with the medical professional mindset of physicians. How much money is spent creating initiatives and bringing on more administrators and hiring more consultants and having more offsites to address problems created by leaders who don't have a deep understanding of the core business of healthcare? How much has a business school ideology of monitoring and control and self-promotion and profit contributed to conflict in healthcare and to harmful decisions? Decisions that result in a dysfunctional EMR that serves a billing and monitoring function, yet wrecks internal medicine and family medicine physician careers. Decisions that lead to Byzantine billing practices that create revenue by obfuscation. Decisions that create inadequate nursing staffing, particularly bedside nurses. Decisions that include reductions in force, classic tactics that sacrifice people's careers to meet a budget that was poorly conceived or, to get this phrase in here one more time, conceived from a place of rational egoism. Yes, we need non-physician administrators in healthcare, but let's reevaluate the roles, numbers, reporting relationships, and skill sets. People are bound to ask, how can I suggest that physicians lead and manage when we're already short of doctors? Not only does physician leadership make sense in terms of the evidence supporting this investment, but surprisingly, tapping our physicians to lead is the single best strategy to address physician shortages. Excellent physician leadership will lead to greater alignment, better support, less burnout, less turnover among physicians and nurses and staff. Respected physicians will raise their hands for leadership roles because the roles will have meaning, authority, budgets, job descriptions, and even, get this, time to do the work. Just as in the other traditional professions, we'll be best served in medicine if physicians lead the majority, not a small minority, of hospitals and healthcare systems. And now, after this deep dive into the bowels of graduate business school training, it's clear that an important part of that shift will be setting new criteria for non-physician administrator training. In my next podcast, I'll talk about organizations where physician leadership is working. Excellent physician leadership examples provide some hope in the healthcare crisis called burnout, which is the topic of License to Lead episode number 4. In many ways, the first 3 podcasts have been laying a foundation to address this epidemic of burnout, affecting the health not just of physicians, but also the healthcare organizations they work in, and most importantly, their patients. In podcast episode number 4, I'll focus on physician career, the clinical diagnosis of burnout, and its connection to the underlying issue facing physicians, a crippling deficit of autonomy. After that, podcast number 5 will follow up on the first 4 episodes, and I'll respond to questions and comments from listeners. Once again, thanks to all of you for spending your time here with me, and thanks especially for all you do and all of your care and caring. To learn more about how we work with physicians and other leaders to create healthy work cultures, or to join in the conversation for future podcasts, go to license2leadpodcast.com, where you can send me an email or leave me a voice message.